So I'm really curious about what this exhibition meant to you. And maybe in thinking about that, what are some of the questions and thoughts that animated your approach to the exhibition?
Well, the exhibitions committee actually invited me to create a proposal for a space in the art center. So that as a site responsive installation artist, that in itself was a great opportunity for me. And then I was able to identify a space that was not a typical rectangular gallery. But in addition to that, the Cleve Carney Gallery and Gallery 2 has this really vibrant lime green floor color, which I'm pretty sure no other gallery in the world probably has this floor color.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, that it seemed like a given that I should propose artwork for this space. And that meant that I could use really vibrant color. And with my art installations, they roughly fall into two categories, one where there is a lot of color, and one where there's more of a limited range of color and saturation, more chromatic grays and natural wood and even black. And often the very colorful art installations are the ones that are outdoors and meant to be public art, because in a larger landscape, um, the color, vibrant color, is going to be really helpful to make a big impact, to draw people from hundreds of feet away. But what the Cleve Carney Gallery seemed to be offering to me was the opportunity to make public art something architectural, something really vibrant and interactive inside an art center. So it seemed like a new challenge for me and an exciting one. The other aspect of the Cleve Carney Gallery that I was drawn to was the openness. Um, and there are partial walls and a column, and then a very open space. So what that made possible for me was being able to break up the rectangle and create a lot of angular, irregular shapes within the space.
Mm.
So then the other thing that, of course, that I thought about was how people would be moving through the space and how to get people to interact with parts of the installation. And so as a public art piece indoors, I wanted to have spaces that um, seemed vast even for an indoor space. So the idea of the archway was important for me, that people would pass through. But then I also wanted to create a corner room that both broke up the space visually and
Mm-hmm.
made a place for people to explore.
Mm. And I think something that was really interesting to me working with you is the ways that you think about scale. And there's something interesting to the process of building a lot of the pieces in your own studio and then transporting them and fitting them in the studio, in the gallery space at the Hyde Park Art Center. And so I would just love to hear more about how you think about scale in general when you're creating installations, and how you thought about it specifically with this exhibition.
Yeah, scale is very important to me, because I'm always trying to extend my reach as far as I possibly can, and so I'm compelled to make things that are much larger than human scale. And the way that I usually do that is by making things somewhat modular.
Mm-hmm.
There's usually a flexibility that's built in, so that there doesn't have to be an exact fit. There has to be a method by which I can make alterations when I'm in the actual space.
Mhm.
So I planned specifically for the Cleve Carney Gallery, but I made sure that that I could make alterations, that things would work in more than one placement within the space.
Hmm.
Did that answer your question fully about in regards to scale?
Yeah, no, it did.
But then
Mhm.
can I
Yeah,
just
go
add,
on.
yeah. So then in my discussions with you, Gervais, of course, we talked about the artwork activating more than just the Cleve Carney Gallery. And,
Mhm.
and it was the collaboration between us that led me to look at I had some modular pieces on the floor in my studio. And I think during one of our discussions, I showed one of them to you, and we talked about making it into a larger sculpture that would seem to climb up the wall in Gallery 2, which leads up to the Cleve Carney Gallery. And then you talked to me about almost having those pieces reach out almost overhead and
Mhm.
creating so that it would create a similar sense that people were walking through and under something even before they got to the archway and the room in the Cleve Carney Gallery. So that was something that was not part of my original proposal or plan, and it's developed because of the curator artist relationship.
No, and I really appreciate it. I feel like so much of this show was about our conversations for me, and being able to spend time with you, listen to your thoughts, listen to how you were envisioning the space, but also your openness to shift with the space. And I think another thing about scale is, and you said it, you create the pieces, but also with the understanding that things may shift when they actually enter into the space. And so you create them so that they can be shifted. And I think there's something very unique about creating such a large installation that also has that kind of flexibility. And that's open to that kind of possibility. And I found that a lot of that, and I found that there was that kind of openness throughout the conversations that we had, which for me made it exciting.
Yeah, it made it exciting for me too. And I remember one time you and I were talking about if there was no discovery along the way, if it was simply executing a plan that had been laid out, that was pretty boring. And that was not really of interest to either of us. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not just practical, it's also more exciting to know that there are going to be problems to solve when you get into a space, because it's the installation art is all about problem solving and responding to the situation you're in at that moment.
Exactly, exactly. So you touched on this a little bit in your first response, but I'm interested in how you think about, both in your work just generally, and also specifically to this installation, how you think about visitor engagement and how you approach the work with that in mind.
I do
Mm-hmm.
always lead people through a space, and I always work to draw the gaze upward. And so that experience kind of underscores some of the content of the work, which is thinking about what our aspirations are, but also
Mm-hmm.
how that can be unreachable. And so in a space that has a grand scale, or even in a smaller space where I'm able to create a sense that there's a grander scale, there are aspects that are unreachable and things that you can't even see, but you kind of stretch to see them.
Mm-hmm.
So the pieces that climb up over the temporary wall and kind of tumble over, there are parts of that that are not visible to the eye. There are parts that are on either side of the wall. And so that compels the viewer to look around and move through and find out how much they can see.
Mm-hmm.
The other things that I think about are whether that is frustrating for the viewer or rewarding. And I think that there can be both
Yeah.
within the. And so one of the main frustrations is often that little ones can't climb the work because it's so inviting and they want to climb.
Mm-hmm. As we've seen with the students at summer camp.
But that's one of the reasons that this piece, it has the smaller cutout shapes that children can climb through climb through safely. So there are ways that they can interact, but at a in a less invasive way. But yeah, and so it can be frustrating, but then there is the realization with more mature viewers that it's more about a mental exploration and traversing the space visually, which is something that you wrote about in your essay.
So depending on how your body is contorting to move through the installation, your gaze shifts and your perspective shifts. So maybe the highest point no longer becomes the highest point, depending on where you're looking or depending on the way that your body is shifting, which I think is also really interesting. And I think holds that tension that you're talking about between aspirations and what remains unfulfilled. And that tension kind of always looming.
Yeah, Isa seemed to understand the work as fully as I do. And so they were able to, in my view, they were able to call attention to visual aspects of the work in a way that would help viewers to understand their physical relationship with those.
Absolutely.
So things like light and shadow that are not concrete were revealed as parts of the installation that each of us still interacted with. But then in addition to that, I think it's interesting what you're saying about contorting the body to move through the space, because most people had to duck to go through, at least to get into the room, but many people have to duck their head a little bit to walk through the archway.
Yeah, definitely I did.
Yes. And that creates an awareness, but as you said, also a different view and a different understanding of the space. But with Isa's performance, where she was touching and almost, to me, it seemed she was finding an understanding of the artwork through touch. And so it was moving through the space, but also touching the work. And it gave me shivers because it felt so similar to the way that I touch and hold the work when I'm configuring it, when I'm testing out how to assemble the various pieces. So it was a thrill for me I almost feel like I could watch myself making the work through watching Isa's performance. I felt like this was such a strong pairing that it's like Isa was the perfect performance artist for this work. And then the other things that Isa did that were phenomenal to me. They interacted with the shadows, like I mentioned. The movement was like dance,
Mm-hmm.
in that it felt measured, and it felt paced to the work itself. So rather than being paced to music as an accompaniment, it was paced to the sculpture itself as
Mm-hmm.
accompaniment,
Mm-hmm.
which I haven't experienced before.
Mm-hmm. I really like what you just said about the way Isa approached the pacing. It matched the pacing of the installation, because I think that's exactly right. And it felt very meditative. The way that they sat with different sections of the installation, the way that they sat with shadows and light, and the way that they sat with stillness. So
Yes,
there was both a dynamic set of movements and also the sitting with stillness and the sitting with quiet, even as there were visitors watching them perform, and even as they had an audience, they were still able to really sit with the pacing of the installation. And so, yeah, no, I definitely agree with what you just said, with everything you just said. Since you talked about it just now, I would love to hear a little bit more about how you thought about light and shadow in relationship to the installation.
yes. So that was another unique aspect of this space, was that I had multiple options for using light and shadow.
Mm-hmm.
So, but of course, like any other space, though, I wouldn't be able to fully anticipate where all the shadows would be, or how the lighting was going to be set up. So that
Mm-hmm.
was something that was uncertain until I started working in the space. But I was able to think about multiple ways of using light. This is a windowless space, which allows you to have more control over a lighting situation. But then it made sense with the fact that I was creating multiple apertures with the work. And so the light, with all of the track lighting, I was able to create a lot of very direct light, which
Mm-hmm.
gave which gave very crisp shadows, so that the shadow had a strong presence. But then I always like to point out to people that when we are talking about shadows, we also are talking about the shapes of light. And so when I'm drawing with light, I'm drawing not only the shadows, but also the shapes of light that are created simultaneously. And of course, the little aperture, the smallest triangle that's in the corner room, creates shapes of light within that small space. And there are multiple overlapping shapes of light because there are multiple light sources. The other way that I was able to use light, the track lighting goes all the way around outside of um, the gallery itself. And so I was able to include a panel that's covered in fabric and lit from behind. Um, I have a light box that is hidden inside the little room that's creating a different kind of luminosity. And then at the very end of the installation, I observed how light and shadow was interacting on the walls, and I did enhance some of the shapes of light with paint color.
Kind of drawing from what you just said, the last things you just said, how did you, I mean, you talk about it a little bit in the beginning, about the uniqueness of the floor of the gallery space. What about, how did you approach color in this exhibition? And I'm interested also in this relationship between light and color. and also between color and scale, because I think part of what also shaped the scale, or the perception of scale, I should say, particularly in the Cleve Carney Gallery, was painting the walls of the gallery in that blue.
Yeah, yeah. And so part of the appeal of the lime green floor is that it is so luminous.
Mm-hmm.
And when it's hit by direct light, it seems so saturated. But then when there's areas that are thrown into shadow, it's much less saturated. And so there's this opportunity to work a range of saturated color within the space. But there's also a sense of reversal in terms of what we usually expect from spaces, because we usually expect that a ground surface would be a darker color, and that
Mm-hmm.
a lighter, more luminous surface would be above us. And so that's why I chose the deep blue as a contrast to the lime green. But the deep blue also has that mutable quality when it's very lit, it seems almost electric, but where it falls
Mm-hmm.
into shadow, it's more of a midnight blue. And so the flexibility of those colors um, is what led to those choices. And just the idea that because we only see color through light, uh,
Mm-hmm.
that while I was manipulating light, I was also manipulating color. And so it is a way. I do paint in space, I do draw in space. So when the use of line and plane is like drawing in space. And when I use colors and textures of surfaces, then it is more like I'm painting in space. So I was able to create um, a lot of depth within a space that is small relative to if I were building an installation outdoors. So we're
Mm-hmm.
asking about creating a grander sense of scale. And the color, you're right, it does have, it plays a big role in that.
No, definitely. And I think that also adds to this immersive experience that you get throughout the installation. So I want to start wrapping up. And it's always just like, you and I have had so many conversations leading up to the show. And also so much came out of what you said in this conversation that hasn't come up before. And so I'm grateful for that. And I'm grateful that we can continue having conversations, and that each conversation feels generative in a new way, and then allows me to look at the work and approach the work in different ways, which is just exciting. It's exciting to see a piece of work continue to shift.
Yeah, I agree. And that of course it is generative because it makes both of us think about the future and what
Exactly.
will come next.
Exactly. That's what I wanted to actually ask you as kind of the closing question is what, um, either how you see this work potentially manifesting in the future, or future projects, and they could be related or not related, that you're excited about. And you can also
Yeah.
respond to both of those.
Yeah, I those are both good questions. And as far as what happens to this piece now, that's a kind of question I get
Uh-huh.
a lot, because the structures don't get thrown in the dumpster. And they're they usually go into storage for a while, because it takes a while for me to get to the point where I could imagine them being transformed into something else.
Mm-hmm.
So I do like to just give myself that possibility that perhaps these works will be transformed into something different in the future. When I do that, it's important to me that it does become something very different. So that means that this installation will never exist again as it is at the Hyde Park Art Center. And that's partly because it will never be in the same space, but it's also largely because I would never try to recreate the same installation. That would defeat my whole mindset about creating an installation. But at the same time, yeah, I do like to reuse physical elements and transform them, and that becomes a new and exciting challenge. But then there are sometimes the pieces don't fit a new situation. Sometimes they don't ever get used. So it has to be um, a time and a place that calls for those particular pieces to be utilized. So that's literally, what will happen with the physical pieces from the installation. But just in terms of my understanding of my own work, maybe never was an exhibition that definitely allowed me to engage viewers physically more than I have been able to. And so people were able to touch the work in different ways than I've been able to before. And so it will naturally lead me to make work that people can touch and even move. So I don't necessarily like the phrase kinetic art just because that almost sounds like it moves on its own. It's more that I think that I'll be making work that viewers move, that the viewers touch and move, so that there's a sense again of the audience understanding the process of making and almost feeling that experience and having discovery, sharing that sense of discovery that the creator feels.
Thank you so much for this conversation, for continuing to give me things to think about and new ways to approach your work and this installation, and for having the opportunity to work with you and listen to your thoughts and go through your process with you and get some insight into your process. So thank you for all of that.
Well, thank you. I've thanked you about this before, but I'll say it for the recording. Just thank you so much for all the thoughtfulness and the time that you have spent with my work. And I think that's what most artists want, is just for people to spend time with their work and be thoughtful about it. And you've given that to me just, on an exponential level. So it's really been a gift.
Thank you. Well, let's end this conversation on that mutual kind of sense of gratitude that we both have.